Well, hello, everybody. I'm really glad to be here today with my friend Alex Woolf. This is round two of our discussions on Celtic Christianity and bringing together scholarship, which Alex is involved with and provides in a way that I do not, and the popular writing side of things, which I don't know how popular I actually am or not, but that's the word they use for writers who aren't scholars, such as myself. And yeah, we wanted to chat about that dynamic a little bit, about things like the Synod of Whitby, about whether nature spirituality is part of the Celtic tradition uniquely or just sort of the medieval spirituality in general. And we wanted to touch on some of the questions that come up with all of that, like what is the role of popular writing and historical scholarly writing, and how do they interplay, and how much should the public care about scholarship, and how much should the scholars care about popular writing, and all these sorts of things. And we were just chatting about it and having a good time, but I interrupted us to start the conversation, so we're going to pick up very soon where we left off. But before we do, I'm reading some text. We were just talking a little bit about this book, Celtic Spirituality. It's by Oliver Davies. It's in the Classics of Western Spirituality series, which is really great if you want primary sources of all kinds. And so this one little quatrain is in his collection of Irish poems in this book, in Oliver Davies' collection, and Thomas O'Loughlin. Let us adore the Lord, maker of marvelous works, bright heaven with its angels, and on earth the white-waved sea. Yeah, short prayer. But maybe I'll pass it over to you, Alex. Where do you want to jump in? How should we start?
You talked about the difference between you as a popular scholar, if that's the right word, or popular writer. You said you weren't a scholar, but I think it is possible for people outside of academia to be scholars. It's possible to educate yourself by reading the right material and so on. But what we were talking about before we started recording was this sort of tension that some people on the academic side of things, on my side of the table, feel very proprietorial and very anxious about non-academic people attempting to engage in academic arguments. I was talking about one friend of mine who doesn't think that popular historians should be called historians if they don't work in universities. But I was presenting the idea that I think that people like you and people like the people who write non-footnoted books for a general public about history and religion and so on are actually doing a really good job in bringing these things together. And there's a real danger with academic, scientific type writing that we live in our ivory towers and we only talk to each other. And we're receiving public funding. We're supposed to be educating people, and one of the ways we do that, I think, is through intermediaries. You may not be an apostle, but maybe you're one of the 70. That's perhaps one way of thinking about it, if you want to use some sort of a religious analogy, that there are other people who are engaged in the mission. They also serve, and I think that's important to remember. And often, I feel it's a bit hypocritical when my colleagues, or some of my colleagues, complain about this, because almost all of us had our first encounters with the subjects that enthuse us and that we've given our lives to through these kinds of things when we were maybe teenagers or kids or undergraduates. We watched some TV show on the Discovery Channel or BBC, or we read some book aimed at popular people, or some out-of-date Penguin classic, and that's what got us on our path that's led us now to the ivory towers of academia and led me to become a professor of medieval studies and so on. I'm quite happy to say I read Tolkien and I read children's novels about King Arthur and all of those sorts of things when I was a kid and a teenager, and I wouldn't be here if I hadn't. And I think that bringing people in and also reaching those people who will never come closer in, giving them half the story is better than excluding them from any of it. And so I think that people like you and these popular historians, popular writers on science and religion, do an enormously important job in working like a kind of placenta between us and you and the wider public. That it has to get out there. And you guys do it. You're these intermediate people who read the real scholarship, and then transform it into a more manageable, more digestible form for people who don't have the time to take a master's degree or whatever in something very specialist.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary for sure of the way that all the wisdom and insights that come from academia sort of disseminate into the public, and I agree, the responsibility of the academy to disseminate into the public, and acknowledging that has to happen through a reduction in intricacy and complexity. Even though as scholars you want to get more intricate and more complex and find all the little nitty-gritties, it has to become more and more general as those who aren't informed about that topic. And it's the same for, I'm sure, you, if you wanted to learn about, say Chinese economics. I don't know if you know anything about that, but you would have to start somewhere, right? You couldn't jump into the latest, PhD research project about it, even as a scholar. You'd have to start.
Exactly. And in fact, I do
general.
that when I'm reading for history more widely. I often start off, if it's outside of my own area of kind of Northwest Europe in the Dark Ages, I'll often start with something fairly basic. I think it's absolutely necessary, and it is more manageable. And also, people don't have time to read all the different articles and all the different arguments. Reading a good synthesis is a good way into this, and and people also, if you're not doing it for a job, you want to be able to relax and take it easy a bit. You don't want to be worrying about the footnotes and seeing all the text in the original as well as in the translation and so on. I mean, what's the point of that?
Yeah, for sure. And I wonder if I could add another dimension to it, though, because while I agree with all that in terms of getting the scholarship out, I also think that there's a value that the popular side adds that scholarship misses just by its nature, not on accident or by default, but just that scholarship is sort of cutting away intentionally subjective things, choices about what we like more than other things, what we want to believe, what we find beautiful, what we find relevant to our lives, like all those kinds of questions that scholarship intentionally cuts out and is necessary for an accurate view of history, leaves a gap for those who want to not be academics, but actually just to be practicing religious people of various kinds in their lives. And so the scholarship is an important piece of that, but then you also need something that says, well, okay, how do I take the life of St. Bridget and how do I incorporate that into my prayer, and how do I make that part of my sacred narrative, and what does that process look like? Is just analyzing the text and understanding its historical documentation and transmission of the manuscripts and all that is beautiful and awesome, and I couldn't read it myself if it wasn't for the translations and all of that work that goes into it. But then the question of how do I teach people in spiritual direction using examples from the life of St. Bridget, academia isn't going to give me that part. And so I think there's a little bit of a give and take that's always true in the church, if I can say that more broadly. Not that I belong to any particular denomination, but that's always true that there are, well, I mean, Paul says it, right? Christ is the head of the church, and all of us are different parts. And how could one part say to another, I don't need you? I mean, what would be the point of scholarship if there wasn't some kind of practical application in the world? And what would be the point of the practical application if it wasn't grounded in the scholarship?
Well, think about when Paul gives that account. Now, is it in Galatians, of his visit to Jerusalem to persuade James and the Jerusalem church that you don't need to require all the Gentiles to adopt all the Mosaic prohibitions on circumcision and diet and so on. We could see all that as being the equivalent of the footnotes and stuff. Yeah. And so Paul realized that if he was going to get it out there to a lot of people to hear the core message of the gospel, you didn't want to kind of bog them down with Leviticus and Deuteronomy first.
Yeah.
And so that you're right. It is there, and of course, going back to my sideline on the Muslims, Muslims think that Paul is the guy who got it wrong. They think that that's where Christianity goes wrong, but because he changes the rules and he tells them to abandon Mosaic law. But I think it's clear that what Paul is doing there is something that many people in many parts of the church and in many other areas have done all the time. That you have to work out what the important things are. Historians of conversion and the spread of Christianity often make a distinction between conversion and Christianization. And by conversion, they mean that a person or an individual or a group of people coming to understand that the gospel has come for them and believing in that the way is through Christ and so forth. Christianization is often thought to take several generations, and it's the becoming a Christian community in total and living a way of life that's recognizably Christian to well-established Christian societies. And missionaries fail if they try and get people to Christianize before they convert. It inevitably takes time. So you have to make decisions about which bits are the important bits and which bits. We can leave that side for 1 minute, for one moment. We don't need to deal with these caveats, these niceties of theology. I don't need to explain to you exactly how transubstantiation works just now. You can think of it as just a symbol if you want, but just take the bread and wine and make the promises, and we'll sort out that later. And it may take a while when you've had people. If we think about the conversion of the Celtic world, or we're going to move on to the Synod of Whitby shortly. If we think about Northumbria, and it's maybe one of the reasons why the Synod of Whitby happens when it does in the 660s. The conversion of Northumbria happened in the 620s and 30s. So we're about a generation afterwards when the Synod of Whitby happens in 664. So one of the things that's happening in that period is that the very late 650s and 660s is when you first start getting bishops who are actually English as opposed to foreign missionaries. And when you've got a beginning of a generation of English people who have been Christian since they were children, perhaps baptized at birth or shortly after birth. Much before the date of the Synod of Whitby, the bulk of adults would have had a significant amount of their life as pagans. And so that leads to a change in the nature of the relationship of the nation, the gens, to the religion, and also the way the local church changes. I think this is something that you see with the nativization of churches, and you see it happening in Ireland as well. Patrick, of course, was Briton from the Roman Empire, as were some of the other early missionaries, and then about 50 or 60 years after Patrick, there's a wave of second-level monastic founders like Winiao and Dochmael and so on, who are also Britons, who bring the monastic rule. And then it's right at the end of the 6th century with the generation of people like Columba and Covgall of Bangor and so on, that we get actual Irish-born people who have been Christians since children rising to the top of the church. And I think whenever you get a new church, there's a moment which is underappreciated, I think, often in surveys, of nativization of the church, when the hierarchy stops being missionaries and becomes locals. And we've seen that happen in the 20th century in large parts of Africa, for example. To begin with, it would have been all French and English missionaries and bishops, and then at a certain point you start getting African bishops. And that changes dynamics in quite a subtle way. Yeah. And so this nativization of churches also perhaps leads people to think about an English church or an Irish church in a way that the missionaries were much more concerned with the universal church. And it also leads to thinking about what works best in their community. They perhaps understand it better, whereas the missionaries perhaps sometimes were a bit uncertain about how to integrate Christianity to the local community. So I think nativization is an element of that as well. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, I think and I definitely want to talk about Covgall, and maybe you can help me understand the history a little better, because I'm really interested in forgive my pronunciation, the Culdees, the Culdees, of whom Covgall would have been one. I believe, and
probably Covgall, probably not.
Okay. So this is why I'm asking for some help. Yeah. So how does that go?
Yes. Well, there's various views on this. The Kelly J, which is the correct pronunciation, although the term Culdees is widely used. It was. I'm not sure where that actually emerges. I've never seen it in a medieval text, but it's certainly what 18th, 19th, and early 20th century scholars called these people. The term derives from two Irish words. J means God or of God, obviously a loan word from Latin, Deus, and the Cayley word is a word that means friend or client. So it's the Cayley J were the friends of God, or possibly the clients of God. And the term is used occasionally in a generic sense. You can say of somebody, oh, so we might say Pope Francis was a friend of God. And in that generic sense that, or the Dalai Lama is a friend of God or something, you think of somebody who you're wanting to say he's particularly pious, he's, clearly very close to the top level. But when we talk about the Culdees or the Celtic as a group, we're talking about some kind of movement that emerged in the late 8th century in Ireland and spread to Scotland and perhaps to Wales as well. And in fact, there is an account of a Celtic house in York in one text, but one text alone, which has often puzzled people from, I think, the 10th century. But there were lots of contacts with Ireland in that period, so it's perhaps not impossible. But one of the difficulties we have talking about the Celtic is describing what they are. They're sometimes described as an order, and they're sometimes described as reformists. But the way that they operated within the church was that small Celtic communities that were, as far as we can tell, always limited to an abbot and 12 followers, obviously in imitation of Christ and the apostles, seem to have been attached to other larger churches. So you would have a regular monastery, which would then have Celtic attached to it, who would have their own separate church, perhaps on the edge of the community. Here at St Andrews, there was a Celtic house, which is right on the cliff top, and it's significantly towards the later Middle Ages, when a wall was built around the cathedral precinct. The Celtic church was outside the precinct, but they're part of the monastery, so it's almost as if they're specialists.
Cool.
So they don't distinguish themselves in the way that an order would. When we think about monastic orders, which really only came into being in the 11th century, they're sort of separate multinationals, and you can think of them as the Cistercians and the Cluniacs are like Burger King and McDonald's. They're almost identical to an external viewer, but they're completely different to an internal person. And they spread out as massive global franchises in every country, and so on. And they have a head office in Cluny or Citeaux or somewhere like that. Yeah. So the hamburger model works because they're multinational franchises that are very similar from an external perspective, but claim to be very different. But those orders are really a product of the 11th century to a large extent. So the Celtic, it's a movement, is the term people tend to use, to create this idea of people who can be purer, and to some extent, it seems to be a response to the anxiety that you see in the insular world, certainly in England and Ireland, of the mainstream church becoming a bit too worldly. And this is the problem that happens. You think about someone like Iona gets founded, like most monasteries do. You get 12 guys with hoes, growing their own vegetables, living an ascetic life, closer to God, like the angels. And everyone thinks, oh, you're really cool. Can I give you some land? Can I give you some free wine? Can I give you access to my harbour for free trade overseas? And before you know it, they've got all this stuff. And it's quite hard to just be 12 guys living the simple life. And so a problem that abbots have is they increasingly become estate managers. Mm. They're managing, and so often there'll be hundreds of peasants living on land belonging to these churches in some way or other. And so the Celtic seems to have emerged as a group of people who are almost performing within monasteries the function that monks are supposed to perform within society, to live as a wholly set-aside group, being
like a meta-monk
on behalf of the greater community.
Yeah.
So as the big churches become worldly, they have these little Celtic communities attached to them. And I think one of the problems that causes in the longer run is it sort of disincentivizes the main part of the church to be very ascetic at all, and they become very worldly, so that when the Gregorian reform arrives in Britain and Ireland in the 11th and 12th centuries, they're a bit shocked at some of these places. And it's quite interesting that there's a famous site in South Wales called Nant Carvan, which was founded supposedly by St Cadog in the 6th century, in one of the cities or more contemporary with Columba and Covgall people. And when the Normans arrive, they say that there isn't really a church there anymore. There's no community there, and they give it to a Reformed house in, I think it's Gloucester. But we actually have texts that were being written there at that time. We have saints' lives and other things that describe a life. But the thing is, they didn't look like monks to the Normans. By that time, they all had their own houses, individual houses with their own servants. They were educated, they were writing things, they did attend churches and things. And the same thing happens here in St Andrews, where I am, where when the Augustinian canons take over the cathedral, the Prior Robert writes an account of what he finds there. And he talks about these 7 persons, he calls them, persones, who run the cathedral, and they have their office by hereditary by inheritance, which doesn't necessarily mean from their fathers, but by being members of a particular kin group. And they all live in separate houses, and they take their share of the wealth and run it from their houses. But they then run the cathedral. So they are doing something. They are maintaining the church in the way that people did. And I think what's happened is, as I said, here at St Andrews, we have Kelly J as well on the cliff top, that there's been a kind of complete separation between managerial monks and secular priests and ascetic Kelly J. Yeah. And the two have become sort of symbiotic but distinct groups within the monastic community, whereas before the rise of the Kelly J, before the Mighty Age, you would have had people who were more all-rounders, if you like, who were trying desperately to be ascetic whilst doing all the other stuff, and it just became too much. And so these roles became divided up. And you have this small core of hardcore ascetics who are the friends of God, and you have everyone else who just tries to run the church.
Oh, that's super helpful. Thank you so much. I've read, there's a book called The Celtic Monk by a man whose name I can't pronounce or remember offhand. It's in this Assertion Publications, and it's got a whole bunch of writings from this movement in it. And so I've read that and digested it a fair bit and written about parts of it and incorporated it into my own spirituality and stuff. But I haven't had the historical overview, just their own rules and their own writings, so you can see the picture like that. And I have a couple questions, if I may. One, I didn't realize that the Cayley part could be like client or friend. I always understood it as servant, which I guess is client. Close.
But yes, the reason that we translate it that way is that in secular Irish society, they didn't have a kind of manorial feudal system in the early Middle Ages in the way that we tend to think of the Middle Ages. Rich landowners, nobles, did have people supporting them, but they had the option to move their allegiance without moving their farms. So they weren't tied in the way that serfs are, because they lived on the land owned by the Lord. A few were, but most weren't. And the term used for them is Cayley, friend, and a lot of it's lordship through the discourse of friendship. So the Lord has his clients over to dinner, a bit like you might imagine in a modern Western society, a manager or a boss has his workforce over to dinner at Christmas time or something, or after a busy week, they go out to a bar and he buys all the drinks. Right. And so that's one of the ways in which the lords presented themselves. So they had this discourse of friendship, but because if they did fall out or whatever, the person could switch lord. Obviously, they're probably limited in how they can switch lords. If you actually live right next door, you probably don't really have a choice. Yeah. But if you live somewhere between two rich men, you probably can play them off against each other and get a better deal. And then similarly, the lord himself would travel around and stay and visit for dinners and things at his servants' houses. So he'd give big feasts a few times a year, and then he'd visit them a few times a year, and then he would support them in court cases. If they got into it, he would act as their advocate and bankroll their legal case. And similarly, they would then back him up if he was in some dispute with someone, whether through law or through force of arms. They'd be expected to support him. So that's what the Cayley in secular society do. And so the idea is so that's and that always gets translated. I don't know who first did this, but certainly for the whole of the sort of 20th century and onwards, that's been translated as client on the model of Roman clientes, I think probably, and so that's the other way Cayley is used, but it is also just used the word for friend. So the word that we now tend to use for Irish or Scottish dances, that's pronounced the same way, but written Ceilidh, Ceilidh. That means to visit, and actually what it actually means is it's a verb based on the same root as the word for friend. It means to express friendship. So to visit someone is to have a Cayley, and that's what it actually means in Irish or Gaelic. It doesn't mean a party. That's an English readaptation of it, English language readaptation of it. It means simply to go around to someone's house and maybe have a cup of tea or something. That's a Cayley in Irish. So it's a way it's expressing friendship. It's engaging in social interaction. So the idea about the Cayley J is that they're the people who are intimates of God, if you like. That might be another way of translating it. The people who are closer to him than the rest of us.
Yeah, that's super cool. I'm going to have to spend some time thinking about symbolically, like how that... It's interesting because that's an example, I think, of how, and I imagine you would agree, of how, culture influences the way we understand our relationship to God, right? Because they're using their own secular metaphors, which are going to be different and have overlap with, the metaphors of Scripture and of the tradition in Rome and of the tradition in, Constantinople and whatever. And so to have that, that is pretty cool.
You hear that God is your Lord. You're going to then map that onto what lordship means in your current world.
Yeah, and it's cool to think of that as something that you've chosen voluntarily and not been forced to do. I feel like that's a really interesting dynamic of the difference of lordship that, like lordship in our at least modern context usually gets presented as something that's enforced, something that's you're born into, and it's just what is, and you have to respect it because you love the Lord, but also because the Lord controls everything and is your master, right?
And that's based on that kind of ancien regime thing that builds up as the Middle Ages progresses. So that, certainly in, say, England, by the end of the 12th century, you've got that kind of lordship, and then it gradually trails away through the early modern period. In France, it's the ancien regime that is overthrown by the revolution. It had sort of faded away a bit more subtly in Britain. But that's something that grows through time in Northern Europe. It's not natural. So Scandinavian lordship was very like Irish lordship. In Iceland, the Icelandic chieftains have what are called thingmen, men who accompany them to the assembly. But the thingmen choose their chieftain. And the Icelanders, actually, when they wrote their constitution in 930, they deliberately arranged that there would be 3 chieftains in each district to ensure that people had a genuine choice. And they had 3 rather than 2 to stop it turning into a faction. Look at the American
Congress.
Very
clever. Yeah, very clever. That's one of the major failings of democracy is the 2-party system.
Exactly, yeah. So the Icelanders thought that through, which is quite remarkable, really, when you think about it.
It is,
So this idea of sort of choosing your Lord, and I think it's also connected to the nature and so on that we talked about before, because these societies have very little cash, if any cash, and food and agricultural production is the main thing that they produce. That's what their surplus is. And so actually eating in people's houses or being supplied with food is the main way that you can express both lordship and friendship. And one of the distinctions you have in secular society in Ireland is these clients or Cayley they're divided into 2 classes who are usually translated as free and base clients, free and base clients. And the difference is the base clients are basically the people who are too poor to entertain the Lord and his retinue in their house. So they collaboratively feed him by giving a portion of food for him to eat in his own house. So you might have 4 base clients can together produce a feast, but the Lord, he has it in his own house. Whereas a free client has big enough kitchen, a big enough dining room table, if you like, that he can have the Lord and his retinue around. The retinue won't be very big. The local Irish ruler was restricted to maximum 12 people he could take around with him, and lesser lords would be less than that. So we're probably talking about half a dozen people, maybe, or maybe a few more, coming into your house and sitting and having a meal, and presumably you and your family, presumably the householder would probably sit with them and eat, but the wife and children and maybe slaves, if you had any slaves, would serve them. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so it's so that's that. So because it's all about, because agricultural surplus is all they really have, which produces food and clothing. It's a redistribution of these things in various ways, and eating and drinking together is a good way of expressing that. And of course, there's these sorts of societies also have the kind of rule that if a stranger turns up, you have to feed them. There's an interesting, very explicit little thing about the stranger and hospitality in a Kentish law code, the first Kentish law code, I think it is, which is from about 600, just after the Roman mission arrived in Kent, where we're told that if a traveller turns up at your house, you have to provide him with bed and board for 2 nights. If he stays for a 3rd night, you can start asking him to do chores. But he's
not even ask him to leave, but just it's time to do the dishes now. But
yeah, exactly. You basically, you're sort of saying, well, you've now become a member of my household, so like everyone else, you have to work.
Yeah, you've squatted long enough. You're part of my family.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
But you can see how,
I have if I may, I have another question about about the language a bit, because part of popular Celtic Christianity that's really important is the idea of Anam Cara, of the soul friend, and so I've absorbed that through popular culture. I call myself an Anam Cara. The primary text that I found to get that actual word is in the teachings of Malruin. I don't know if I'm saying his name right.
Malruin,
Malruin,
yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
And so I've gone deep into that and that kind of idea, and I've taken a lot of those teachings, and they resonate with a lot of the larger monastic reading that I've done, and I've incorporated them with different things. But that's the only place I've seen the term Anam Cara actually used, and I'm curious how that relates to the Cayley friendship versus the Cara friendship, and whether or not those are part of the same movement.
I think the Anam Cara thing does seem to be associated with the Cayley J.
Yeah.
The Cara is obviously, it is an Irish word, but it's cognate with caritas, charity, love, right, and so on. So I think it's probably more intimate and more not romantic, but more, it's closer to love than friendship, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So it's so your Anam Cara is the lover of your soul as well. It's someone who will really stand with you. He won't just come around for the odd dinner party. He'll be someone who will listen to your deepest fears and anxieties. Yeah. So I think that's what it's like in modern Welsh. Cariad is the word you would use for darling or beloved. It's how you would address your sweetheart.
Yeah.
And so that's the car stem is stronger than the Cayley stem. It's love more than just social, if you like.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the two cross over a bit, but I would say that's the broad distinction between them. And so the Anam Cara, it's about 2 people. It's basically you're being your confessor, your advisor, your therapist. It's something which is intimate and shows a real personal commitment that's slightly more than the occasional hanging out together that you might do with your clients. I think that's probably the best way to think about it. But the term does appear, I think, first, you're right, in Malruin's writing, and is occasionally used in other texts associated with the Cayley J. And I think I'm remembering this right. I think it's Malruin who, there's a story told of him that he asked the female abbess, St. Samson, to be his Anam Cara. She was a very aged abbess at the time. I think it's Malruin. It's someone associated with him, if it's not him, but I think it's him. And she said, no, I shouldn't be because I'm a woman. He said, but you're an old woman and so on. You're not exciting my lust or whatever. And she took a brooch off and she pushed the brooch into her own flesh until liquid came out, blood presumably. And she said, look, I'm still I still have the juices flowing in me, and that means that I can't. I'm not away from the world altogether. I can't. I'm still a woman, and therefore the two of us should not spend a lot of time alone together.
Yeah, that makes sense. You find that kind of sentiment all over the monastic texts in Ireland for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And this idea, we did have a research student in Edinburgh, sadly died very young, who did her thesis, was doing her thesis. Morgan Wagner was her name. She was from Colorado, and she did her thesis on this idea of moisture and the association of physical pollution with moral and spiritual pollution, looking at a lot of these texts and trying to see what continental patristic texts they came from, and the gradual way in which people begin things. And one thing that was both sad and a sign of her brilliance and so on is that I went to see her in hospital. She had breast cancer, and she'd been operated on, sadly not successfully, but I went to see her in hospital, and she had this sac draining the fluid off from her wound, and she lifted it up when I came in, and there was this kind of the blood and sort of pus all mixed together, and she said, "Look, physical pollution, just like in my thesis."
Well, she had a sense of humor, I guess, till the end.
She did, right to the end. She was a great girl.
Oh, there you go. Well, what I'm wondering right now is if you think in the KLJ there would have been an intentional sort of dynamic between being the friends of God in one way, that's a different kind of friendship, and then acting then as the friends of the church and the people in the church in this other kind of way. And if there's some sort of intermediary of friendship, if I could call it that, or a connection between these two kinds, or is that just an English translation into friendship and the words just aren't related in the context at all?
I mean, I think in the broader sense, yes, but I'm not sure in the narrower sense. You may be right that they're not really as connected. I think it's where it probably does reflect is that it probably what's key to both those things is the idea of intimacy. That to have a good relationship with God, you have to really separate yourself off from the world, and that and that's also tied into the way that if you're going to be a helper of a king or abbot or whatever, as their Anam Cara, it has to be a close one-on-one thing without distractions. What they were very against was performative spirituality. So, for example, another of Moel Ruin's sayings is that if you go to Rome, the only thing you find there is what you take yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, and in some of their writings, they'll have like detailed explanations of how to receive money from the wealthy, because they'll sometimes say that the money from patrons can be like cursed. I'm trying to remember the text that it was in. It's in one of the KLJ texts that you can accept a just ruler's money, but not an unjust ruler, because you'll take that sin upon yourself by accepting the money.
So that's the thing we see debated now about whether museums and universities should take endowments from oil companies or arms dealers or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. And I love that they were wrestling with that, and that I mean, I'm just projecting, but I'm guessing that would provide a kind of counterbalance within the culture as well. That if the lords or the kings or whoever they are at that point in history want to have an Anam Cara who's a KLJ, which is a good thing spiritually. It brings you power, it brings you prestige, I assume, it makes you look good, all that kind of stuff, as well as being helpful in your spirituality, that they're going to have to be approved by them, in a sense. It almost provides a kind of like, well, how many slaves did you take this year? I mean, it's twice as many as last year, and I don't know if I'm going to fast for you. I'm not going to do your penance this time.
I think so, although there's an interesting character we don't fully understand how this works, but in that early period of the KLJ, which is the founding period that Ruin is part of, which is, although I think the earliest person described as KLJ is Duvlitia, who dies in the late 8th century, but most of them are around in the early 9th century. There's amongst the fathers of the KLJ, and there's a list of I want to say 12, but I think there aren't 12. I think there's fewer than 12. Um, uh, Fathers of the Kelly J. One of them is a guy called Fedler McCriven, which is not as easy to say as it sounds. It took me a long time to learn how to say that. And when he dies in the 830s, he's described as anchorite, scribe, and best of the Irish, Optimus Scotorum. But he was the king of Munster. He sacked Clonmacnoise. He sacked Clonfert. He killed hundreds of monks in a series of military campaigns in the 820s and 830s. He took the submission of the High King of Ireland whilst he sat on the abbot's throne in Clonfert. And yet, the Kelly J texts just present him as if he's a wonderful person. I'd say his obituary in the Annals of Ulster, which were written not in his own kingdom, but in another part of Ireland. He was from the southwest. His centre of power would have been sort of Cashel and County Tipperary. And so that sort of southwestern part, the nearest modern city would have been Cork or Limerick. The Annals of Ulster were being at this time written somewhere nearer to Armagh, somewhere on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic now. So he clearly was thought to be a great spiritual person. One of the other interesting things is the period that he's active is, one thing he does is he actually captures the Archbishop of Armagh at some point and holds him hostage. But the period he's active in is also the period when there's the greatest Viking attacks on Ireland, or a period of it. And although he fights many battles, he never fights the Vikings. He doesn't align with them, he never fights them. And one possible interpretation of him is that he's made an analysis, which is not entirely untrue, some modern historians would agree with it as well, which is that the Viking attacks are happening because the churches are too rich. That's why places like Lindisfarne and Iona get sacked.
Why else do you get robbed if you don't have money? No one robs the poor. Well, that's not true at all. But no one robs specifically one poor person. You have to rob a whole bunch of poor people.
If they'd been 12 guys with hoes growing turnips or something, the Vikings would have passed them by, or maybe even made a donation.
Yeah.
And so one possibility is that he's thinking in what's the word now? Providential terms. And that he sees the cause of the Viking age is the corruption of the church and the worldliness of the church. And the churches he targets are the richest churches in Ireland. And he may simply be saying, this has nothing to do with Christ. This has nothing to do with poverty and so on. And that he is attempting to radically destroy the over-wealthy churches that don't have Kelly J communities and haven't engaged in any kind of reform. No text tells us that explicitly. It's quite puzzling, the fact that the texts all praise him for his religiosity, but at the same time, all they do is recount him attacking monasteries and other Christian Irish leaders. So it's puzzle. But he is also one of the founders of the Kelly J, one of the fathers of the Kelly J. So that they could get angry. They could throw the tables over in the temple. I think that's probably what you should think about him doing at Clonmacnoise and Clonfert. He's like Christ in the temple, getting rid of the moneylenders. That's probably what he thought he was doing, to my mind. And he may have thought that if the whole church reformed and all the Irish clerics became Kelly J, the Vikings would disappear in a puff of providence.
Yeah.
They've been sent by God to punish people for being too rich and worldly and forgetting their original 6th century commitments.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a lot of fun stuff to think about for sure. Yeah. So I guess in terms of where we started, you had talked about the process of nativization of the church when it's no longer foreign bishops. Oh. And then now it's local bishops. And I guess the KLJ then would be like almost the next wave after that then. So you've got your nativized local initial spread of Christianity, which has all its forms that you could define more than I could. Yeah. And then I'm going upwards in history. This is future. and then after that, the KLJ come along to reform and return back to what someone like Patrick and Bridget and Ninian, at least mythologically, legendarily, would have taught. Is that the kind of mentality, like we want to go back to
I
those
think
first
so,
founders?
and I think you probably see this kind of sequence happening almost everywhere, but in different specific time periods, depending on when the conversion was and so on. And you could probably even see it within, say, some of the mainstream Protestant churches, the various waves. It happened in the Church of England. When you get very puritanical waves, and you get sort of lazy Jane Austen period parsons who don't seem to really know anything about religion, and then you get mid 19th century reformists and so on. That so yeah, I think these are waves, and I think that the worldliness that some writers like Bede are always really beginning to worry about in the 720s, by another generation after him, it's really taken over, and you've got Ian Wood, who's a recently retired professor of medieval history from the University of Leeds, who's a great expert generally on Western Europe and on the Frankish kingdoms, but also on the Frankish mission to Central Europe.
I think I have his translation of the life of Columbanus. Is that's the same guy? Yeah,
that's the guy. Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, but he also has written quite a short little book quite recently, probably about 5 years ago, where he points out that in the 7th century, for the area that he's talking about, for Gaul, which is his main area of interest, almost all the wealthy landowners were churches, and churches owned a huge amount of the land. There isn't really a large secular aristocracy in that period. There's kings, and then there's aristocracy an aristocracy of service, as people say. So people who become members of the king's retinue and then do jobs for the king, and they might get some land, but the kind of land that they get is tiny compared to what the big churches, the cathedrals, the major monasteries have. And he compares it to the situation in sort of feudal Japan, where the temples owned most of the land, and the samurai were mostly tenants of the temples for much of the medieval and early modern period in Japan. And he says we should take the models that people have used to study East Asian history in the Semitic world, where the temples were the big landowners, and perhaps try and apply it to some of these periods. And I think something similar happens a generation or two later in the insular world, in Britain and Ireland, because they were converted later. And that's what the Celtiae are kind of rebelling against and reforming against. So those kinds of reforms perhaps happen in other periods in Europe. But this idea that the church, ironically, because people admired their asceticism, they gave them loads of stuff which prevented them from being ascetic and corrupted them. It's the classic corruption story, though. It's almost like, and you can see it with individuals as well. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So you go from being St. Patrick to Darth Vader in 3 or 4 generations.
Yeah, and there's a tendency, of course, whenever someone is successfully ascetic and becomes truly holy, at least in the when you read the historical accounts of such things, that people flock to them, and there's this. It's part of the story of monasticism, right? I'm thinking of Simon Stylites out in the desert somewhere in the Middle East. And he wanted to get away from everyone so much that he built this giant pillar out in the desert and sat at the top of this giant pillar. And then people would start to flock around him, and eventually they threw ropes up with buckets to give him offerings and beg him to say prayers. And I think eventually they got him down and turned him into a bishop or something. And he fought the whole way, and that's kind of almost a trope sometimes for some of the more politically minded historical figures of the church, I think, where
it's of course the thing that
I was forced to do this. Almost every letter begins with, "I'm only daring to write this because you have forced me, and I am obedient to your word, dear master, father, whatever."
Of course, there's in papal enthronement still, the Pope has to be dragged to the throne 3 times, doesn't he?
Oh, does he? I didn't even know that. So there you go. It's like official. It's not even just subtle.
It's
there you go.
Now, yeah. So now it's just performative humility.
Yeah.
But I'm not worthy, or whatever. Yes, and of course it's pilloried in in the Life of Brian with that scene where people identify the guy as the Messiah, and he's saying, "No, you're all individuals," and they say, "Yes, we're all individuals."
Yeah. That's such a great movie.
Yes,
Yeah,
and one
for
of them
sure.
says,
I'm not the Messiah, and then they're just like, "Yes, you are."
yeah, exactly. So yeah, so I think there is that danger, and it must have been, and it must also happen within the individual careers of people. A lot of people who started out as very pious monks were perhaps chosen because of their piety to be an abbot or prior, and then they find themselves frustrated by the inability to get practical tasks done, and so start cutting corners and behaving tyrannically, and maybe also thinking things like, well, if I'm going to if I'm going to improve pastoral care and get more churches built, I'm going to have the king over for dinner, and we've got to have a dining room that suits the king, and we get a good
it's real
food
life
and
stuff.
so on.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure we have the best wine in, otherwise the king won't be impressed with us. And then you kind of get used to, and then you think, well, okay, we have the king this week, I'll have the archbishop over next week. And it's all about networking. I'm really doing it for you. In a way, we have this in universities as well. The university presidents or principals or vice chancellors often have kind of mansion type houses where they do a lot of corporate entertaining, if you like. And I guess corporate entertaining itself is like that. Going
and
to
the churches today still have to, form committees to fill out paperwork to apply for grants to the government. It's not the same thing as having the king over for wine or meat or whatever, but it's still the same kind of process where you've got to give up some of your prayer time, some of your practical time, some of your service to the public.
You probably do spend a lot of time meeting with city planning people and so on.
Yeah. Well, there you go. This has been great. I feel like that's kind of a natural pause. I'm not sure. Is there anything else you wanted to add into the conversation? I don't have to go this moment. We've been about an hour, but if you want to keep going or wrap up, I'm not sure where you're at.
I'm happy with that. But we can go for a little bit longer if you want to. I mean, did you want to hear more about Synod of Whitby, or have we?
Yes, yeah. So I'd be curious to hear, especially how it ties into this process of nativization that we began with. So yeah, maybe we could wrap up with that, and then say, well, for you, good afternoon and good evening, whatever it is, and for me, good morning, and I'll go make lunch.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So, well, the Synod of Whitby happened in 664, as I mentioned earlier, and it's one of the best known events in the sort of ecclesiastical history of Britain and Ireland in the pre-Viking Age, and in fact, it only really applied to a relatively small part of Britain, the Kingdom of Northumbria, which was a big kingdom in Britain at that time, but there were multiple kingdoms. So we're talking about somewhere that's roughly the northern third of England and the southern quarter of Scotland was in this kingdom called Northumbria that had been founded only relatively recently by unifying a number of other kingdoms. It was English by speech, though many of the people living in it were probably Britons, who also spoke a different language, a language related to Welsh. And Northumbria had been initially had a mission that had been Italians sent from Rome via Canterbury in the 620s, who had some success, but not very much success in converting the kingdom. There'd then been a period after foreign invasion when there'd been apostasy, and then missionaries had come about 5 years later from Iona, Gaelic-speaking missionaries, Irish missionaries from the island of Iona in Scotland. So it's a generation or two after St. Columba, but so that they've probably been taught by people who've been taught by Columba. And the leading one is Aidan. And they arrive in the 630s, and they are more successful in converting Northumbria. And then, as I was talking about earlier, over the next couple of decades, they train up local guys, and by the 660s, most of the bishops in England, both those coming from the Italian-based churches and those from the Irish-based churches, are now English. And we have an English Archbishop of Canterbury and English bishops in most other places. There is still one Irish bishop in Northumbria, Colman, because what had happened in Northumbria, slightly oddly, is that when the the missionary bishop died, another one was sent from Iona rather than chosen from amongst their own flock. Now, the story that we're told by Bede, who's our main source, but our only source for the Synod of Whitby, is that because the Northumbrian king at the time, Oswiu, had married the daughter of the king who'd been around at the time of the Italian mission to Northumbria, but whose family, after he was killed, had fled to Kent, where the Italian mission was based, in the city of Canterbury. The Queen and the King had clergy with them, chaplains, who followed slightly different practices. Now, they were married for nearly 20 years before the Synod of Whitby, so this clearly wasn't an overriding problem. But one of the key issues, in fact, the key issue, that probably there wouldn't have been a synod and a debate without it, although it wasn't the only difference, was the way of calculating the date of Easter. Mm-hmm. Now, the Irish Church and the British Church at this time, and therefore most of the Northumbrian Church and a few of the other English churches, followed a way of calculating the date of Easter that was based on a table that gave a complete cycle every 84 years. The date of Easter would vary. That had probably been created by a guy called Sulpicius Severus, who lived in Gaul at the turn of the 4th and 5th centuries. So he's the guy who wrote the life of St. Martin of Tours in the 390s, I think. So he's alive between about 370 and 420. I think that's when we more or less think that Sulpicius Severus was around. So he devised this 84-year calendar, which was used for a long time in Gaul and was the one that was exported to Britain and Ireland. But there have been a number of upgrades since then, which the insular churches had missed out on. And when the Italian missionaries came directly from Rome, they were bringing the central upgrade. So I explain this to students by saying that it's like having guys turning up who've got Microsoft 11 or whatever, or Word 11 rather than Word 8 on their computers. And they're kind of saying everyone's got to have this now. And this became an important factor in 664 for two reasons, probably. One is probably that these two cycles quite frequently turned out with Easter on the same date. So it wasn't a problem in many years, but some years it was. And in that year, they were particularly far apart. They were nearly a month apart. So that not only meant that the Easters was played on separate Sundays, it wasn't even that one was just a week later. It meant that if you think about the King and Queen, if they were living together at this period, then Lent would be maybe 70 days. Yeah. And so that might mean they couldn't have sex or eat at the same time for 70 days.
Yeah.
And so that became a real practical problem for the two royal courts. The other factor, I think, is probably connected with nativization, because at the time, the island of Britain had originally been inhabited by people called the Britons, who spoke a language ancestral to Welsh. Most people in Britain in 664 were probably still Britons, but much of the richest land in Britain was ruled by English speakers, people who spoke a Germanic language, who were descendants of 5th century invaders. And the Northumbrian kingdom, along with most of the other kingdoms, the eastern half of the island, were dominated by these people. And there had been a long tradition of conquering land from the Britons. So there's a long-term ethnic tension. Right. I'm sure North Americans, all descended from white settler colonists, can probably understand that. And I think that probably when the missionaries arrived from Rome or Ireland, they didn't really make much difference between Britons and English. They're all people who we need to look after. But once the English became bishops and so on, they still had. It's hard to get over ethnic prejudice. Many of us like to think we're not racists in any way, but even most of us who are liberals feel slight discomfort if we find ourselves in a room where we're the only person with our skin colour or the only person who has our native language. But that's kind of natural if you grow up or brought up in a racist society. And if you think that in the generations for 10 generations maybe, or a bit less than 10 generations prior to the Synod of Whitby, the English have been constantly conquering territory from the Britons, fighting against the Britons. They would naturally have felt suspicious about them in the way that we do about whether it's Western Europeans about Eastern Europeans, or black people about white people, or white people about black people, or Native Americans, Native Canadians, and so on. It's hard to overcome a long history like that. You can't do it overnight. And so I think that must have been an element as well. And one of the clues to this is that the other major account of the Synod of Whitby, alongside Bede's, is in the life of St. Wilfrid by Stephen of Ripon, who's sometimes called Aedius Stephanus. And in that life, it's made explicit that as a result of the Synod choosing to go with the Roman Easter, the 19-year Easter cycle, rather than the 84-year Easter cycle, Wilfrid, who was one of the bishops at the time, was able to appropriate lots of churches that had been staffed by British clergy, that the British clergy who didn't accept the change in Easter were expelled from their churches, and they got hold of them. So that would be like the sort of thing that might happen in the Reformation in Europe, or if you can imagine, if you took living in a totalitarian regime today where the government decided they're going to back one church and the churches of all the other denominations were handed over to them. So if the governor of Utah gives all the Episcopalian churches to the Mormons, or vice versa, and that's the sort of thing that we should imagine happening. So I think that's a factor. But one of the interesting things about this is that this has been presented as one of the big divisions between Celtic Christianity and the other Christianities. But in actuality, half of the Irish Church had already accepted the new Easter in the 630s. They'd had correspondence with the Pope, they'd been persuaded. And Ireland was divided north-south at that point. And over the next few years, the rest of the Irish churches did as well. Iona holds out longest, but only by about 50 years. And I suspect the reason for this is that they seem to convert almost immediately Wilfrid dies. And since Wilfrid is the one person who's supposed to have said that St. Columba, the founder of Iona, was a heretic, I think they just didn't want to give him the satisfaction. I think they kind of knew that they were going to have to change, but they weren't going to do it on his watch. So you could imagine that as being like, a peace treaty being made after a change of president in the country that you're at war with, because you've spent too much time having negative rhetoric against President Z, and once it's somebody else, once it's President you, then you can have a reconciliation. So this is, I think, one of the things that's interesting about the Synod of Whitby's place in the Celtic Christianity debate is that a lot of the things that the Celtic Easter, as the 84 Easter is sometimes called, and the form of tonsure that was being used, which was one of the minor things that were discussed at the Synod.
And just to clarify for people, that's a haircut. Tonsure is a haircut. Yeah.
So the monks who came from Rome had the crown of their hair shaved, which is how most monks you'd meet today would, and the Irish monks had it shaved in a different way, which we're not 100% sure about, but it's often thought to be shaved back from the front, so following the natural way of the hair. But we're not 100% certain about that, but it helps to imagine it that way, because this is one of those shortcuts we were talking about at the beginning of the talk.
Yeah.
It's if we had to make a movie, that's how we do it. Yeah. So all of these things are actually all resolved within 50 years of that. So by 720, there isn't an issue anymore. Mm-hmm. And there are still differences between the Irish Church and the English Church and the Church in Rome, because the changes are always happening. And one of the ways to think about this is that the centres of the Church, which by this time, certainly by the 9th century, 8th or 9th century, the Western Church is relatively separated off from the Eastern Church, so that what we might call the Latin Rite Church. Most of the innovations start in or around Rome, or with churches closely connected to Rome. They get the imprimatur from Rome and they spread out. So you think about ripples coming out or fashions coming out, and they reach different places slightly later. So Paris fashions will reach London before they reach Galway. And in the modern world, or Milan fashions perhaps is nowadays more on point than Paris fashions. and so you're just a little bit behind, and so the Ireland and Scotland and Wales and bits of England are often a little bit out of kilter. So in every generation, there's usually some annoying reformer coming from the continent or southern England saying, "You're not doing it right." Nobody does it like this anymore, but it's a different thing every time because it's a new reform, and so it's being on the edge that's the problem.
Right.
As the ripples spread out.
Yeah, and
so
sounds...
the Synod of Whitby is we have the best account of it with speeches on both sides and so on. So it's a really nice poster boy for what's actually a long, enduring process.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of like a symbol of a much bigger unfolding, and it's interesting because it sounds like all of the topics that were discussed and the reasons for them, especially, were less about theology or spiritual practice, and more about sort of outward things in church politics. Whereas I think in a lot of the modern sort of contemporary Celtic Christian presentation, the Synod of Whitby is understood as sort of a Roman imposition of theology of original sin and that kind of stuff. I can see you smiling because you know it's not true, but I'm just sort of bringing it up as a way it's often presented.
That's right. That is the way it's thought, but it is practical. And one of the things why we academic historians don't like the term Celtic Church is that there was nothing doctrinal about it. Only in Stephen's account of what Wilfrid says at the Synod is there any suggestion that the people following the 84-year Easter are heretics. Nobody else says they're heretics. Bede says they're not heretics because it isn't doctrinal. It's not about doctrine. It's not about dogma. It's about practicality. It's about organisation. It's about how the deck chairs are organised. It's not about... So at no point were these people out of communion with Rome. They were going on pilgrimage to Rome. Famously, Avra Columcilla says that Columba was known in Rome. Whether that's true or not isn't important. What's important is that in the late 6th century, an Irish Christian praising an abbot of Iona thought that Rome and Iona were on the same message. They were on at the same place.
Yeah, and I think maybe it's helpful. Yeah. It's helpful for people to think about Rome at the time also as something bigger than a denomination. Rome was the symbol of civilization before Christianity even came. Like Rome is just like the heart of civilization, of culture, of language, of science, of math, of everything. It's the huge metropolitan center of all these rural places. And so even before Christianity, there would have been a sense that like, oh wow, you went to Rome? Wow, what did you learn in Rome? Right? Like I hear they got all kinds of roads over there, and toilets and stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
You could tell it better, but I think because there's often this sense of today we have what we call Roman Catholic Church, right? The Roman Catholic Church. Yeah. And that, though, I don't want to say I'm not trying to say it didn't exist because there's a continuity, but it wasn't what it is today. And maybe you could speak a little bit about that if you like, yeah.
Exactly. Well, that is a big problem because I think a lot of people in the 19th century, you certainly see this in the historiography, they conflate the Church of Rome, which in an early medieval context literally means the church in Rome, like the Bishop of Rome and his diocesan priests, with the Roman Catholic Church. Now, of course, the Roman Catholic Church really only came into existence with the Reformation, because you mentioned continuity, but of course, all of the Protestant denominations are also descended from the pre-Reformation Roman Catholic Church. Martin Luther was a Roman Catholic, or was a Catholic. He accepted when he was ordained a priest. It was in communion with Rome, and everyone descends from that. So it's rather than think of the Roman Church and the others, you just have to think of everything changes in the 16th century, and then you get fragmentation. And so in our period, also an important thing to remember is that the kind of hegemony of the papacy hadn't fully evolved. It's in the process of evolving. It's a gradual evolution. The really key moment when it begins to look like what we're used to thinking about is the late 11th century, during what's called the investiture contest, when the papacy falls out with the Holy Roman Emperor. Technically, we don't say Holy Roman Emperor, but I'm saying that because that's what people would understand. But so the German kings who claimed to be the heirs of the Roman emperor. And at the same time, it ties into the rise of these new reformed monastic orders that I talked about earlier, like Benedictines and Cistercians and so on. And from that period onwards, over the next 150 years or so, from about 1050 to about 1216, then you get a series of reform movements, councils and so on, and that ends up with a very uniform church in which definitely the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, is the managing director, chief CEO, whatever you want to phrase it. Prior to that, he's sort of a primus inter pares, and not even that really. So for most of the period up to certainly the 6th century, and probably further on, church decisions are taken by church councils. There's a few what are called ecumenical councils, which are supposed to be the whole church from the whole world, which in the 4th century was probably just about possible, but rapidly become less possible as the church spreads out and politics becomes more fragmented. Fall of the Roman Empire and spread of Christianity mean it's harder practically to do. So you have a lot of provincial councils. So that means everybody under a single archbishop or patriarch meets together, all the bishops and some leading abbots and other people, church lawyers. And those happen fairly regularly. So we have a good record of these in Gaul, in roughly speaking what's modern day France plus a bit of its neighbours. In the 6th century, there's probably half a dozen of these things. And at these meetings, which might just be for a single ecclesiastical province, might be for a couple of neighbouring ones, different bishops will bring up issues that they've encountered in their diocese, and they'll say, well, we've got these women in the west of Armorica who are handing out the bread during the communion. Is that okay, or should the priest give it directly to people? And they have a chat about it, and then they go, no, women shouldn't really be handing out the bread in Holy Communion. That should be something for the priest to do. So that becomes a rule. But because these are happening as provincial councils, you end up with slightly different rules in different places, and different things concern people. So one church council, the Council of Elvira in southern Spain, one of the issues was, is it okay to ask the rabbi to bless the crops in the field? And the bishops decide that's not okay because the rabbi's not Christian. But it shows you different things happen. No one in Ireland would ever have asked that. Right. But that's one of the reasons that the different churches end up doing different things. So when we talked about the changing of the date of Easter, it had changed in other parts of the country because you've been encountering there were actually three forms of calculating Easter in play in the 7th century. There's the 84-year Easter, which we tend to call the Celtic Easter, though it's actually Sulpicius Severus's Easter. And then there's what's called the Victorine Easter or Victorian Easter, which was created in the 5th century by Victorius of Aquitaine, which is a 19-year cycle, but it doesn't work. It gets out of sync very quickly. And then there is the Dionysiac Easter, which was originally from the east, from Alexandria, I think, but gets adopted in Rome in the 6th century. And one of the possible reasons that the insular churches reject the Dionysiac Easter is they know the Victorian Easter doesn't work, and they may be slightly confused, thinking, oh, we've tried this 19-year Easter, it doesn't work. And they don't realise it's a different 19-year Easter. Right. Oh, you haven't tried my 19-year Easter, so come on. Really? You're going to try and sell us that? Sell us the same dog twice? No way.
Yeah, and you gotta wait 20 years to find out if it worked, I guess. Exactly. Which is a real bummer in terms of investment.
Yes.
But
so the Church of Rome, the idea of having everything having to be rubber stamped by Rome, that's something that evolves over what we might call the long 12th century, from the late 11th century to the early 13th century. There's got to get this right, Fourth Lateran Council, convened by Innocent III, is really the thing that sets everything up, and that's in the early 13th century. And even that has variation built into it, because that's the place where it's made the rule that priests can't get married.
Right.
But Scandinavia gets a stay on that, gets an exemption, because the Scandinavian bishop said, we just will not be able to recruit people if you make that a rule. And so the council says, okay, for the time being, Scandinavia, and the idea is that they'll work towards that. Whereas in fact, they don't work towards that. When the Reformation happens in Iceland, they don't just hang the bishops, they hang their wives and children too. So, so even then, there are regional variations. People recognise regional traditions. But yeah, when we think about the Roman Catholic Church, we think about the fact that as a concept separate from the rest of the church is really part of the Reformation as well. They're as much a product of the Reformation as the Protestant churches, but also even that idea of sort of papal monarchy, if you like, that arises much later, only after the Norman conquest, really, or in England, and about the time of the Norman invasion of Ireland. So
when we use the words church in the context of the Celtic Church and the English Church and the Roman Church, when we're talking about Whitby, we're not actually talking about denominations. We're just talking about local decisions and groups. And it's almost like, I was part of the United Church of Canada, which is a mainline Protestant liberal church. I was a seminarian for a while. And, we had our local congregations, and then we had our presbytery, and then we had conference. It's all changed now, but back then that's how it was. But exactly. It's all one church. But you might have in one province of Canada a very different expression of the United Church, say in Alberta, than you might in, say, BC, even though they're right beside each other. British Columbia, very different cultures, the two provinces. And I could see the representatives from those presbyteries all coming together for conference or for the national and saying like, well, this is our stance on Trump's tariffs, and this is what we want to do about that. And there's disagreements and there's stuff, but at no point are they actually a different church denomination. They're just different churches. Local churches.
Is a good example for a secular parallel as well, because of course your political parties are like that. You can be a member of the Ontario Liberal Party, or a member of the Federal Liberal Party, or a member of the Alberta Liberal Party. They're actually different, but they're all broadly aligned, and they all kind of believe the same thing, but it's organisationally different. And as you say, they can take slightly different stances on different things. So that's right. So in a way, again, this goes back to the beginning. Remember, back to St. Paul, he writes letters to the Church of Corinth, or the Church of the Galatians, or whatever,
or the Church of Rome,
or the Church of Rome, or the Church of the Hebrews, and he's not thinking of these as being different denominations. So the Church of somewhere can just be the church in somewhere, as it were. That's probably a bit of a way of thinking about it. So that's church with a small c rather than a big C. So the idea of denominations, the closest thing to denominations in the early Middle Ages would have been heresies, as it were, or things that were regarded as heretical, in which case, in the period that we're mostly interested in when we talk about Celtic spirituality and so on, which is really the period up to about the Viking Age, so from about 400 or 500 to about 800 or 900, is when most of the texts and so on that we use come from. Pretty much everybody in Europe and North Africa belonged to the same church at that point. To the east of that, you had churches that were Miaphysites, who had a slightly different explanation of how Christ could be both God and man. And then beyond them, there were people who we tend to call Nestorians, but don't like being called Nestorians, but I've forgotten what they do like being called.
Those would be like the Syriac churches and stuff like that. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, I love the Syriac churches. Dionysius the Areopagite, Ephraim the Syrian. Like these guys are amazing. I love that stuff.
Exactly, and I think they're a very good place to look for parallels with because they're, as I was saying the last time we spoke when I was talking about parallels between earliest Islam and Christianity. When you're on the edge of that Roman world, the world that St. Paul and Jesus and St. Augustine inhabited is very Mediterranean, very urban. And once you start moving beyond that, once you end up being in the interior of Syria, in Arabia, in Ethiopia, Nubia, the interior of North Africa, Britain, Ireland, and so on, you just have to articulate things differently. You're not hopping on the metro from Antioch to Constantinople, and so on. It's a completely different world. You need to use different metaphors, different language, different parables, to explain to people what's going on. Different ideas about lordship, to go back to what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's probably maybe a good place to wrap it up, because yeah, we came full circle. Yeah, and the Synod of Whitby was about who gets to own the churches and whether or not the king and queen get to eat together and sleep together for 70 days or not, and how we should cut our hair. And there was no Roman church in the sense of the Roman Catholic Church today. There was just the church in Rome, which people looked up to and thought was really great. And had a sense of authority like an older brother maybe, but not in the sense of a police officer or a judge in the same way. And all of it wasn't Rome imposing anything on anybody, and it was local English and Irish churches trying to figure out how to harmonize themselves with the broader church that's centered in Rome. Is that a fair summary?
I think so, and it's a bit of the relationship with England is particularly peculiar because it is the one place that Rome sent a specific mission to. That Gregory the Great in the 590s did send a mission so you actually got actual Roman clergy going to somewhere hundreds of miles away and trying to set up a church. But that was unique to southern England. And so that tends, within the English context, we talk about Roman and Celtic, or Roman and Irish, because those are the two main places missionaries came from. But they had to jump over a whole lot of in-between stuff, where the differences would have been very gradual, and everyone would have been kind of someone living in central France would have kind of been able to see the point of view of both the Romans and the Irish, and so they would have been somewhere in the middle. And so it's unusual that Gregory chose to do this. And the story is it's because he met these pretty boys in the slave market and thought that they deserved to be their families deserved to be converted. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. But it is pretty unusual. It may be partly that it was the one major province of the Roman Empire that wasn't Christian because it had fallen to the Saxons so early. But for whatever reason, it's very peculiar and unusual to have that direct contact between Rome and the outer edges. That usually goes through intermediaries. And I think that meant that the communication was less good.
Yeah, you've got some telephone game going on.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Alex. I can't express how much I appreciate you generously just sharing your time and expertise with us. It's very kind.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
It's always good to talk to people outside of the little kind of bubble that we academics live in.
Yeah, well, I love to peek into your bubble, so we can do it anytime you like. But for today, we'll wrap up and say thank you so much, and you have yourself a great day.
You too, Justin. Take care.